My parents called me a worthless failure and threw me out. "Go sleep in your car," my dad yelled. They didn't know I owned a luxury penthouse in New York, so I just smiled and left. 3 weeks later, they showed up at my door begging for help. I, 32M, was called a worthless failure by my parents and thrown out of their house. They had no idea what I'd actually become. The words hit me like physical blows, but I kept my face blank. My father stood in the doorway of the house I grew up in, his face twisted with contempt, telling me I was a disappointment, a failure who'd never amounted to anything. My mother stood behind him, arms crossed, nodding along with every cruel word. They wanted me gone. Out of their house, out of their lives. Dad practically spat the words at me. "Go sleep in my car, figure out my own pathetic life, stop being a burden on people who actually mattered." I looked at them both for a long moment, let them finish their tirade, then picked up my jacket and walked out. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, just smiled, got in my car, and drove away. They had absolutely no idea where I was going, and I intended to keep it that way. The drive from their suburban Connecticut home to my place in Manhattan took 90 minutes. 90 minutes of processing what had just happened, though honestly, I'd seen it coming for years. My parents had always been obsessed with appearances, with status markers they could brag about to their friends. My older brother had given them everything they wanted: medical degree, marriage to a lawyer, 2 grandkids, a house in the right neighborhood. He was their golden child, their proof that they'd done everything right. I was the other son, the one who dropped out of college, who disappeared into the tech world, who never talked about work, who drove a modest car and wore jeans and hoodies. To them, I was the embarrassment they had to explain away at dinner parties. They'd spent years making little comments, asking when I'd get a real job, wondering aloud why I couldn't be more like my brother. This blow-up had been building since I'd arrived for what I thought was a family dinner. Apparently, my brother had just gotten a promotion, and my parents wanted to celebrate their successful son while reminding their other son of his inadequacy. I pulled into the underground garage of my building in Tribeca just after 9. The attendant greeted me by name, and I took the private elevator up to my penthouse on the 42nd floor. The doors opened directly into my living room, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, designer furniture I'd barely had time to enjoy, art on the walls that cost more than my parents' house. I'd bought the place 2 years ago, after my third startup got acquired. The first one I'd founded at 23 had failed spectacularly. The second one barely broke even before we sold it. The third one changed everything. We'd built a cybersecurity platform that solved a problem every major corporation had, and when we sold it, my share came to 8 figures. I was 29 years old and set for life. But I'd never told my parents, never corrected their assumptions about my life. At first, it was because I was busy, too caught up in work to bother. Then it became almost amusing, watching them pity me while I sat on a fortune. And eventually, it became a test. I wanted to see if they'd ever ask about my life with genuine interest rather than judgment. They never did. I poured myself a drink and stood by the windows, looking out at the city lights. My phone buzzed with messages from my brother. He'd apparently heard about the blow-up and wanted to check in. I ignored them. My brother wasn't a bad person, but he'd never stood up for me either. He'd let our parents tear me down my entire life because it made his own path easier. The next 3 weeks were peaceful. I threw myself into my current project, my 4th startup, because I couldn't seem to stop building things even though I didn't need the money. I met with investors, hired talented people, worked 16-hour days because I wanted to, not because I had to. I didn't contact my parents. Didn't call, didn't text, didn't acknowledge their existence. My brother kept trying to reach out, but I kept declining his calls. On day 19, he finally got me to pick up. He sounded stressed, told me Mom had been calling him constantly, asking if he'd heard from me. They were worried. I told him I was fine and that they'd made it clear they didn't want me in their lives, so I was respecting their wishes. He tried to argue, said things had gotten out of hand, suggested I be the bigger person and reach out. I hung up. 3 weeks and 2 days after they'd thrown me out, my doorman called up. My parents were in the lobby, asking to see me. I stood in my living room, considering telling him to send them away. But curiosity won out. I wanted to see their faces when they realized where I lived. I told him to send them up. I watched the elevator numbers climb. Opened the door before they could knock. My mother saw me first. Then her eyes went past me into the apartment. I watched her face change, confusion replacing whatever expression she'd arrived with. My father was still looking at me, hadn't noticed the surroundings yet. He started to speak, voice softer than it had been 3 weeks ago, saying they needed to talk, that they'd been harsh but I had to understand their perspective. Then he actually looked past me, saw the apartment. His words died mid-sentence. I stepped aside and gestured them in. They walked past me like they were entering a museum, heads swiveling, taking in every detail. The custom furniture, the art, the view that stretched for miles. My mother actually gasped when she saw the windows. I closed the door and waited. Dad turned to me, mouth opening and closing, finally managing to ask whose place this was. I told him it was mine. Bought and paid for. No mortgage. He tried to process that, asked how, with what money. I gave them the short version, 3 startups, 1 successful exit, enough money to never work again, but I enjoyed working so I was building another company anyway. Mom sat down heavily on my couch, looked up at me, and asked why we didn't know about any of this. Her voice had gone small, uncertain. I told her the truth. They'd never asked. They'd decided who I was without ever bothering to learn the reality. They'd been so convinced of my failure that they'd never questioned their assumptions. The silence stretched out. Dad looked like I'd punched him. He tried to recover, said this was wonderful news, that they were proud of me, that they'd always known I had potential. I cut him off, told him we both knew that was a lie. They'd spent years making it clear I was the disappointing son, the failure, the one they were ashamed of. 3 weeks ago, they'd thrown me out of their house and told me to sleep in my car. They didn't get to show up now and pretend they'd always believed in me. Mom started crying. The manipulative kind of crying she'd always used to get her way. She said they'd made a mistake, that they'd said things they didn't mean, that surely I could understand they'd been frustrated. I remained standing, arms crossed, and asked what exactly they were frustrated about. She fumbled for an answer, said something vague about communication and expectations. I told them they'd shown up at my door after 3 weeks of silence. They hadn't come to apologize for what they'd said. They'd come because my brother had probably told them I was fine, and they couldn't stand not knowing where I was or what I was doing. And now that they'd seen the apartment, seen the evidence of my success, they were recalculating their position. Dad tried a different approach, got defensive, said I'd hidden all of this from them, that I'd let them worry, that what kind of son doesn't tell his parents about his success. I laughed at that, asked him what kind of parents throw their son out without ever asking about his life. Pointed out that I'd been at dozens of family dinners over the years, and not once had they asked what I actually did for work beyond surface-level dismissive questions. They decided I was a failure and stopped looking any deeper. The conversation went in circles for a while. They tried different tactics, guilt, anger, appeals to family loyalty. Nothing worked because I'd spent 3 weeks processing what had happened, and I'd realized something important. Their treatment of me wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a pattern that had been going on my entire life. I was the son they'd written off, and the only thing that had changed was that now they knew they'd written off someone successful. Eventually, Dad got to the real point of their visit. He mentioned they were having some financial difficulties. The words came out awkwardly, like he was forcing himself to say them. Their investments hadn't performed well, and they'd made some poor decisions with their retirement accounts. My brother had helped them out some, but he had his own family to support, and they needed more substantial assistance. There it was. They hadn't come to apologize or reconcile. They'd come because they needed money, and they'd just discovered their failure son was actually their rich son. I looked at them both for a long moment, saw the hope in their eyes, the expectation that blood would matter more than history. Mom even reached out toward me, said something about how family takes care of family, that surely I understood they'd made mistakes, but they were still my parents. I told them no. The word hung in the air. Dad's face flushed red, and he started to argue. Raised his voice, said I owed them, that they'd raised me, put a roof over my head, that this was cruel and vindictive. I let him finish, then spoke quietly. Told him they'd had a son who would have helped them without question. That son had shown up 3 weeks ago for a family dinner, and they'd destroyed him with their words and thrown him out of their house. They'd told that son he was worthless, a failure, a burden they didn't want to carry. So that son was gone. Mom was crying harder now, the real kind of crying. She said I couldn't mean this, that she was sorry, that they'd said terrible things but they loved me. I asked her when she'd last shown that love, when she'd last treated me with basic respect or kindness. when she'd last defended me instead of joining in when Dad tore me down. She had no answer. I told them they could leave. Dad tried one more time, voice turning cold, saying I'd regret this, that they wouldn't forget how I'd turned my back on them. I told him he had that backward. They'd turned their backs on me years ago. I was just finally accepting it. They left. The apartment felt enormous and empty after they were gone. I stood by the windows for a long time, expecting to feel guilty or sad. Instead, I felt lighter than I had in years. My brother called an hour later. He'd apparently gotten an earful from our parents. He was angry, told me I was being petty and cruel, that they were our parents and they needed help. I asked him if he'd been there 3 weeks ago when they threw me out. He went quiet, admitted he'd heard about it after, said it sounded bad, but surely I could be the bigger person. I told him I was done being the bigger person, done accepting scraps of respect from people who should have given it freely. He could help them if he wanted. He was the golden child, after all, the one they actually valued. But I was out. He called me selfish and hung up. Update 1. It's been 6 months since my parents showed up at my apartment. I haven't spoken to them since, and I've blocked their numbers after the 100th call and message. My brother tried to play mediator for about 2 months before giving up. He's angry with me, sent me a long message about how I'm tearing the family apart and that our parents are struggling. I didn't respond. What I didn't include in my original post was that I'd actually done some digging after they left that day. I wanted to understand exactly how bad their financial situation was, whether they were genuinely in crisis or just wanted my money for convenience. I have a friend who works in finance, and with the limited information I had, he helped me get a clearer picture. Turns out their situation was largely self-inflicted. They'd refinanced their house twice to fund my brother's medical school and his wedding, then took out another loan for some renovations they didn't need. They'd invested heavily in some scheme a friend recommended without doing any research, and it collapsed. But they weren't destitute. They had equity in their house, decent income from Dad's pension, and Social Security. They were facing a lifestyle downgrade, not poverty. My brother, meanwhile, was stretched thin supporting his own family and sending them money every month. He'd apparently taken out a loan to help them, which explained why he was so angry with me for refusing. If I'd helped, he could have stopped draining his own accounts. I felt a moment of sympathy for him until I remembered that he'd watched them treat me like garbage for decades and said nothing. He'd benefited from being the favorite while I was the scapegoat. His financial stress wasn't my responsibility. The story didn't end there, though. 2 months ago, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was my father's sister, my aunt, who I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd heard about the situation from my parents and wanted to tell me I was in the right. That shocked me enough that I actually listened. She told me my parents had always been like this, obsessed with image and status. She'd watched them pit me and my brother against each other since we were kids. She'd tried to intervene over the years, but they'd frozen her out for suggesting their parenting was problematic. She'd called to tell me she understood why I'd walked away and that I shouldn't feel guilty. We talked for over an hour. She filled in pieces of family history I'd never known, patterns of behavior going back decades. It helped more than I'd expected, having someone from that side of the family validate my decision. Last month, I heard through mutual acquaintances that my parents had sold their house. They'd downsized to a smaller place, cleared most of their debts, and were living within their means. They were fine. Not comfortable in the way they'd been, but fine. My brother had apparently stopped sending them money once they sold the house, which caused another family blow-up. I've started therapy, not because I feel guilty about my decision, but because I realized I have decades of dysfunction to unpack. Growing up as the scapegoat child did more damage than I'd acknowledged. My therapist has helped me see patterns in my own behavior. The way I'd kept my success secret was its own form of dysfunction, a test I'd set up that my parents were always going to fail. I don't regret cutting them off, but I'm working on understanding why I needed their validation for so long, why I'd maintained a relationship with people who clearly didn't respect me, why I'd kept showing up to family dinners to be insulted and diminished. My 4th startup is doing well. We've got funding, a solid team, and a product that's gaining traction. I'm dating someone I met through work, and I've told her everything about my family situation. She comes from a similar background, and it helps having a partner who understands. Sometimes I wonder if my parents will reach out again, maybe when they're older and need care. I don't know what I'll do if that happens. For now, I'm focused on building a life surrounded by people who value me for who I am, not what I can provide them. The penthouse still feels too big sometimes, but I've started making it feel like home. I host dinners for friends, mentor young entrepreneurs, and I've started a foundation to fund education for kids from difficult family situations. Turns out having money is most satisfying when you use it to help people who remind you of your younger self. People trying to escape family dynamics that are suffocating them. I don't know if I'll ever have a relationship with my parents again. Right now, I don't want one. Maybe that makes me cold, but I'm okay with that. I spent 32 years trying to earn love that was conditional on being someone I wasn't. I'm done performing for an audience that will never applaud.